That bag is mine. Megan Obi didn't turn immediately. She just stopped walking. The black crocodile handbag rested on her arm like it belonged there, because it did. Across the marble floor, Seo Heijin was already moving in fast. Angry. Certain. You, Heijin said, pointing straight at her. That bag disappeared from the VIP lounge. The entire gala shifted. Megan finally turned. A slow look. The bag. Then the woman. And somehow, she said calmly, you decided it ended up on me. I'm not asking, Heijin snapped. I'm telling you. Hand it over. Megan gave a small, almost amused smile. You crossed an entire room, she said, to accuse me over a handbag? Heijin stepped closer. You don't belong in spaces like this. The room tightened instantly. Megan's expression cooled. Say that again, she said quietly, and see what happens next. Heijin didn't hesitate. Her hand shot forward and grabbed the bag. Everything stopped. The strap jerked against Megan's arm. A thin scratch appeared on her wrist. Megan looked down at it. Then up. Cold. Still. You just touched me, she said. Security moved in immediately. Ma'am, step back. Megan didn't look away from Heijin. This is assault, she said calmly. That word changed everything. Release her immediately, a security officer ordered. Heijin hesitated. Half a second too long. Across the room, a calm voice cut through the silence. Let go. Everyone turned. Jae-hyun stood there. No rush. No panic. Just control. And for the first time, his eyes weren't on Heijin. They were on Megan. And clear this immediately, he added. This is not a negotiation. Silence dropped. Because now it wasn't drama anymore. It was consequence. And then the room waited to see who would break first. If you've ever been judged, touched, or underestimated in a room you had every right to be in, you already know exactly why this moment matters. Like this video. Subscribe. Because what happens next at this gala changes everything. I didn't mean to, Heijin said. You grabbed me, Megan said. Twice. Security exchanged glances. No, Megan continued, shaking her head slowly. Don't minimize this. She walked across a room full of people and accused me of stealing based on nothing. And when I didn't crumble, she put her hands on me. That's what happened. That is exactly what happened. We have security footage, the head guard said carefully. If there's a dispute about ownership, the footage will settle it. Perfect, Megan said immediately. Let's go. Heijin hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Long enough for two people nearby to notice. The crowd followed like a current pulling toward shore. The monitors were set up in a back corridor near the security desk, and by the time the footage rolled, there were easily 30 people watching. Gala staff, guests, a photographer who had quietly followed the trail of tension, and Jae-hyun, standing slightly apart from the group, his arms loosely behind his back, watching the screen with the same focused calm he had shown throughout everything. The footage appeared. And within 15 seconds, it was over. The footage played. Everything collapsed. She had left the bag behind. It was never stolen. It had been moved later. The room didn't erupt. It got very quiet in a way that was worse than erupting. And then the gala director stepped forward and said, Miss Seo, I think it would be best if you left the event for this evening. I am not leaving, Heijin said. Security, detain her until we verify everything, the director said sharply. If she resists, involve the police. The silence that followed had texture. Nobody defended Heijin. Not one of the 30 people standing in that corridor. Her friends looked at the floor or at their phones or at anything else. The guests who had watched her march across the room with certainty now arranged their faces into careful blankness. Heijin looked at Jae-hyun. He said, quietly, she crossed the line first. That sentence, in front of all those people, was its own kind of verdict. Heijin's expression went through several things at once. Shock. Embarrassment. A fury she couldn't express without making everything worse. And underneath all of it, something that looked like genuine disbelief, not that she had been wrong, but that she had been seen being wrong, and that no one was going to help her recover from it. Megan didn't wait for an apology. She picked up her bag, adjusted it on her arm, and walked back down the corridor the way she'd come, head straight, pace unhurried. As if the entire gala had simply been a minor inconvenience she was done accommodating. Jae-hyun watched her go. Then he followed. She was on the outdoor terrace when he found her, standing against the stone railing with the city laid out below her and her arms crossed and her jaw still tight with the aftermath of adrenaline that had nowhere left to go. The night air was cool. Music from inside floated through the doors and made the silence around her feel more deliberate. "You handled that better than most people would have," he said. "No, I didn't." She didn't turn around. "I wanted to drag her across that marble floor." He paused. "But you didn't." "Only because I was wearing a good dress." He almost smiled. He stopped it, but not quite in time. She turned around and looked at him directly. Her eyes were sharp, still running hot with everything she'd just moved through. "You stood there watching for a long time." "I did. That's not a neutral thing. I wanted proof before I said anything." "And if the footage had been erased? Or if security had decided it was easier to believe her? What then?" He didn't answer. There wasn't a good answer, and they both knew it. Megan looked at him for a long moment. Not with contempt, with something more complicated than that. The kind of assessment that takes in more than the surface. "You people wait too long to do the right thing," she said finally. "Not because you don't know what the right thing is. Because you calculate the cost first." She picked up her small clutch from the railing, nodded once, and went back inside. Jae-hyun stood on the terrace alone for a moment. The city hummed below him. He looked at the doors she'd disappeared through, and something settled behind his eyes, the particular expression of a man who has just been told something he suspects is true about himself and isn't sure what to do with it. He had her name. That night, sitting in the back of his car after the gala, he typed it into his phone. Megan Obi. He wasn't expecting much. He thought maybe a modest label, boutique clientele, regional influence. Something that explained the confidence without fully accounting for it. What he found instead stopped him mid-scroll. Her label wasn't a boutique. It was global. It had been global for years, moving quietly through the luxury market the way genuinely powerful things often move, without announcing themselves, letting the product speak while lesser brands spent money on noise. She had dressed celebrities at major ceremonies on 3 continents. Not dressed them in the way brands pay for placement, dressed them in the way designers get called personally, because the celebrity trusts no one else. She had been profiled in publications he respected in ways that said the same thing in different languages. Here is someone who built something real. He set his phone down, then picked it up again. He made one call that night, to his head of business development. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. By the time he reached his apartment, an introduction had been requested. 1 week later, she walked into a boardroom where he was already seated. She saw him and stopped for just a moment. Not from surprise, from recognition. Then she walked to her seat at the table, greeted the executives who stood to acknowledge her with easy authority. Ms. Obi, the lead executive, said, "Thank you for making the trip. We've been looking forward to this." "So have I," she said. Across the table, an executive mentioned the Paris collaboration. It landed in the room with weight. Jae-hyun watched his colleagues' expressions carefully. They had done their homework. They were impressed. And then Megan looked across the table and met his eyes with an expression that was perfectly controlled and said, without saying anything, that she knew he had noticed and that she had clocked every moment of it. "You didn't mention who you were," he said, when the executives had stepped out briefly. "At the gala. You didn't ask. Most people in your position would have led with it." "Why would I?" She tilted her head slightly. "Would it have made that woman let go of the bag faster?" He looked at her. "No. Then it wouldn't have changed anything important." The executives came back in. But the conversation between them had begun, and it continued underneath every other conversation in the room for the rest of the afternoon, in the way he refilled her glass before she asked, in the way she corrected a projection figure without looking at her notes, in the way he watched her handle a junior executive's clumsy interruption without raising her voice or breaking composure. She looked at the man who had cut her off mid-sentence for the second time and said, pleasantly, "If you interrupt me one more time, you're welcome to finish the presentation yourself." The room went quiet. The executive did not interrupt again. Jae-hyun said nothing, but something in his expression deepened. He looked at her the way people look at things they have decided, quietly and without fanfare, that they want. In the days that followed, they worked together closely. Not in the romantic way yet, in the way that precedes it, where proximity produces a particular heat that neither person has acknowledged out loud. They disagreed sharply about pricing strategy, and the argument was interesting. She pushed back on his assumptions about Western markets in ways that turned out to be correct, and he pushed back on her instincts about Korean press access in ways that turned out to be equally correct. And they arrived at decisions that were better than either of them would have made alone. He remembered small things she mentioned. The week after, she'd noted offhand that she preferred her meetings before noon because her thinking went flat in the afternoon. He quietly began scheduling their working sessions for 10 o'clock. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it, but she noticed. Then the photographs appeared. Two of them leaving the building together after an evening session, heads angled toward each other mid-conversation. Another of them at a dinner that had started as a client meeting and had run 3 hours past what was necessary. They weren't compromising photographs. They were photographs of two people who were clearly in the middle of something, even if neither of them had named it yet. Haejin saw them the same morning they circulated. She had not recovered well from the gala. Her social reputation, which had always rested on the comfortable certainty that she moved through elite spaces with unquestioned authority, had taken damage that couldn't be quietly repaired. People had seen the footage. She had tried to rebuild quietly. She had said at dinners that Megan had been aggressive, that she had been defensive in an unfortunate situation, that the optics had been poor on both sides. But the phrase "both sides" had nowhere to land because the footage existed and the footage had only one reading. When she saw the photographs, something in her stopped calculating and simply reacted. She called two women she knew in the social press. She used careful language. Coded language. The kind that didn't say anything direct but hung the suggestion in the air like smoke, that Megan was unstable, that she was difficult, that the gala incident was only one example of a pattern. That Jae-hyun was being naive, that he was too controlled to recognize manipulation when it looked like confidence. None of it spread the way she hoped. Because people who had been at the gala were still talking about what they'd seen, and what they'd seen was Haejin grabbing a woman's bag in public and being removed from an event while the woman she'd accused stood completely steady. The attempt to reframe it now, weeks later, only made Haejin look more desperate. People who had tried to remain neutral began quietly placing their sympathies elsewhere. And the people she'd called began telling other people she'd called them. Jae-hyun heard about it within 48 hours. He sat with it for a day, then made a decision, and went to find Haejin at the foundation office where she spent her mornings. She knew from the moment he walked in that this wasn't a conversation she was going to be able to manage. "You embarrassed yourself once already," he said. "She humiliated me," Haejin said. "Publicly. In front of people I've known for 20 years. And you stood there and let it happen." "No," he said. "She embarrassed you. You started it. And then you stood at a security monitor and watched the footage prove it in front of 30 people. Jae-hyun, what you're doing now," he said quietly, "is worse than the gala. Because now you know it was wrong and you're still doing it. She walked into your world out of nowhere and suddenly. She built her own world," he said. "You just didn't know it. And instead of living with that, you're calling people." Haejin went very still. "You're choosing her," she said. He didn't deny it. He looked at her steadily for a moment, the way you look at a situation you've already arrived at a conclusion about, and said, "Come to dinner this Saturday. I want you to apologize to her in front of my family. Not because I'm punishing you. Because it's the right thing to do, and I think on some level you know that." Haejin stared at him. "You want me to sit across from her at your father's table?" "Yes." She said nothing for a long time. And then, because she still believed that showing up was better than not showing up, because she still believed the situation could be recovered, she said yes. She should have said no. Jae-hyun's father, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair and the particular dignity of someone who has earned every gray, liked Megan from the moment she sat down. He asked her questions, real questions, the kind that means someone is actually listening to the answers. About the label. About how she'd started. About the markets she found most interesting. He laughed twice. He leaned forward once. Haejin watched all of this from across the table with a smile that was working very hard to remain in place. The conversation moved through the first course easily. By the second course, Haejin had shifted her approach. She was too smart to be obviously hostile. She chose the more efficient weapon, which was the comment that sounds like nothing until it lands. "Fashion success can be so unpredictable," she said lightly, to nobody in particular. "Something thriving today, gone overnight. It's a difficult industry to sustain. There was a small pause. Then Megan said, pleasantly, so can marriages built on money? The table went absolutely silent. Haejin's smile didn't move, but her eyes did. Jaehyun's father looked at Megan with something that might have been suppressed amusement. He said nothing. He picked up his glass. The third course arrived. Haejin recalibrated again. This time she aimed at something more structural. Luxury spaces have always required a certain kind of refinement, she said. Not everyone is naturally suited to them. It's not a criticism, it's just a reality. Megan set down her fork very carefully. She looked at Haejin across the table and said, with the same pleasantness that had come before, then why were you snatching handbags in public? The silence was different this time. Harder. More total. Somewhere at the end of the table, a serving staff member appeared to become very focused on something near the wall. Jaehyun's father set his utensils down slowly. Not aggressively. Just completely. Haejin's composure had developed visible cracks. The evening was not going the way she had constructed it in her head, and the more Megan refused to be provoked into something unpolished, the more Haejin's own behavior stood out as the only unpolished thing in the room. She looked around the table and saw Jaehyun watching her with the expression she hated most, not anger, not contempt, but the quiet patience of someone waiting for something they know is coming, and something in her gave way. Women like you, Haejin said, and her voice had lost its smoothness, confuse money with class. The table didn't freeze this time. It crystallized. Jaehyun's father turned to look at Haejin with, enough, he said. The father set his utensils down. Slowly. Deliberately. I've seen enough. He looked at Haejin. You're a guest in this house. Act like it. The word was quiet, and it cut through everything. He looked at Haejin with the kind of cold composure that doesn't need volume, the kind that comes from age and certainty and a deeply private fury. What exactly is wrong with you, he said. Haejin opened her mouth. No, he said. I'm not asking rhetorically. You grabbed this woman at a public event over a bag you had left on a settee. You were asked to leave. And now you sit at my table and say this to her in front of my family. The room was utterly still. You did not embarrass this family, he said. I want to be very clear about that. You embarrassed yourself. That belongs to you alone. Haejin's face had gone through shock and was somewhere past it now. Her eyes were bright and fixed, and she was very clearly trying to find a version of herself that could respond to this and failing. Then Jaehyun said, quietly, completing it, you owe Megan an apology. Haejin looked at the table. At her hands. At the arrangement of silverware in front of her that had been placed there by someone paid to make guests comfortable and which was doing absolutely nothing for her right now. She didn't apologize that night. She pushed back her chair and excused herself and didn't come back, and the table released its held breath and the dinner resumed, and Jaehyun's father spent the rest of the evening asking Megan about expansion into East Asia. And Megan answered him with a warmth she hadn't fully shown before, and the evening ended quietly. But in the car on the way back, Megan was subdued. That situation, she said. Around you. It's messy. I know. I mean structurally messy. Not just her. The way everyone watches. The way everything gets decided in rooms and at tables, and people spend the whole meal calculating. That's not. It is, she said gently. I'm not criticizing you. I'm telling you what I see. She looked out the window at the city passing. I built my life very carefully. I have worked for a long time to be in a position where nobody can question my right to be in a room. And I am not interested in becoming some kind of project for other people to talk about. That's not what this is, he said. She looked at him. How do you know? He was quiet for a moment. For the first time in the conversation, he didn't have an immediate answer. And she saw what that meant, saw the slight forward shift in his posture, the careful way his eyes held hers, the absence of the usual control, and understood, quietly, that whatever this was, he was as uncertain about it as she was. Which was its own kind of answer. She said goodnight and got out of the car. He watched her go. 3 days later, Haejin appeared at Megan's headquarters. No entourage. No prepared statement. She sat across from Megan in the small meeting room off the lobby and looked uncomfortable in the way people look when they are doing something against their natural instincts and doing it anyway. She didn't cry. She didn't perform contrition. She said, with the awkward honesty of someone who has had time to think and hasn't enjoyed what the thinking produced, I reacted to you before I knew anything about you. I saw how you walked in. How you carried yourself. I saw the bag. And something in me, I don't fully understand it, but I know it was wrong, decided you didn't belong there. And I acted on it. In the worst possible way. Megan listened. She didn't make it easier for her. Heijin continued. I think you scared me. Not you specifically. What you represented. Someone who walks into spaces like that without needing permission from anyone. I have spent my entire life learning how those rooms work, learning the right things to say and wear and carry and stand beside, and you just walked in like none of that mattered. And something in me decided that was an aggression. She stopped. I know that says something about me, she said. Not you. Megan was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I'm not angry anymore. Heijin looked up. I was. For a while. But anger like that is expensive, and I don't have the room for it. Megan looked at her steadily. I accept the apology. Heijin exhaled. But Megan continued, I want you to understand something. We are never going to be the kind of women who choose each other. Not after this. I'm not interested in manufactured closeness, following public disrespect. That's not something I do. She let the words settle. You can move through your life knowing you said what you needed to say. I can move through mine knowing I heard it. That is what this is. That is the limit of it. Heijin nodded slowly. She looked like a woman who had come expecting less and received something she hadn't anticipated, not forgiveness in the form she wanted, but something more honest and harder to dismiss. She stood. She said thank you. She left. Megan sat alone in the meeting room for a moment. She looked at the city through the window, and her expression held the particular stillness of someone who has put something down and is deciding whether they feel lighter. She did. Slightly. The rooftop was quiet when she arrived. Seoul spread out below in every direction, lit up and enormous and indifferent to all the personal dramas being played out in its buildings. There was a low table with wine already poured, which told her he had thought about this in advance, and she found she didn't mind that. Jae-hyun was standing at the edge with his hands in his pockets, looking at the city. He turned when she arrived. You knew I'd come, she said. I hoped. She walked to the railing and stood beside him. For a while, they didn't say anything. It was the first time in weeks that silence between them wasn't loaded with other things: strategy, tension, observation, calculation. This silence had space in it. She noticed that. She let herself notice it. You walked into that gala alone, he said finally. She didn't answer. You didn't know anyone. You didn't have anyone to signal your position to the room. You were just there. Present. Completely. I've been walking into rooms alone for a long time, she said. I know. He paused. And somehow everybody else looked smaller. She turned to look at him. Really look, the way she hadn't let herself fully do in all the weeks of meetings and boardrooms and careful professional distance. He was looking at her with the same quality of attention she'd noticed from the beginning, the attention that didn't skim or categorize, that actually landed and stayed. She felt something she hadn't let herself feel in the middle of all the noise of the past weeks. Something quiet and warm and slightly terrifying. You took your time getting here, she said. I was calculating costs. She laughed, a real laugh, not the sharp defensive one she'd used at the gala, but something lighter and genuine. He watched her laugh, and something in him settled. Bad habit, she told him. I'm aware. She turned back to the city. He stayed beside her. The wind moved slowly. Somewhere below them, Seoul continued doing what cities do. You didn't lose the bag that night, he said. You lost the room. She didn't say anything. But she didn't move away. And for the first time since she'd walked into that gala carrying a bag she'd bought herself with money she'd made herself, and someone had tried to take from her what she'd built, she let herself simply be still. Not guarded. Not calculating. Not waiting for the next thing to defend against. And he stayed beside her, and the city stretched out below them, and that was enough. And just like that, she walked out with something more valuable than the bag. Respect. What would you have done in her place? Comment below. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe for more.